If someone protects you in silence, it usually means the danger is already closer than you think. The night in downtown Chicago was heavy with cold wind and flickering streetlights, and Emma Walker walked home alone after finishing her late shift at a small diner on the edge of the financial district, her steps quick but steady, hands holding her worn bag tighter than usual. She had grown used to being invisible in a city that never paused for people like her. Yet tonight something felt different, like the air itself was watching her. Unbeknownst to her, Ethan Cole, a man known only in hidden circles as a figure of absolute control and quiet authority, was already present in that same city block, observing from a distance where shadows met glass reflections. He had not spoken to her, not approached her, not even acknowledged her existence in any visible way, yet every movement she made was already being tracked with unsettling precision. For Ethan, this was not intervention yet. It was calculation, a quiet correction forming in the background of his world. Emma turned down a narrower street, unaware that the usual sounds of the city were slightly distorted tonight, as if the environment itself had been subtly adjusted around her presence. A passing car slowed but never stopped. A figure across the road shifted position, then disappeared into the crowd. And above it all, Ethan stood in silence on an upper-level walkway, his expression unreadable as he studied her path like a man reading a future he did not fully intend to change, but already had. There was no conversation between them, no shared glance, only a strange, invisible thread forming through distance and awareness. Emma felt it as unease, a quiet pressure she could not explain, while Ethan registered it as vulnerability, something he had not planned to care about. The city remained loud, but between those 2 points of existence, everything had narrowed into something dangerously focused. And in that narrowing, without a single word exchanged, the first shift in both of their lives had already begun. The next morning in Chicago felt deceptively normal, with sunlight reflecting off glass buildings and traffic moving in steady rhythm. Yet Emma Walker carried a lingering sense of unease from the night before as she prepared for another shift at the diner. She told herself it was just fatigue, just the weight of long hours and too many worries stacked together, but something in her memory refused to settle. Meanwhile, across the city, Ethan Cole had already resumed control of his structured world, seated in a high-rise office where silence was not emptiness but command, surrounded by unseen layers of influence that responded to his presence without question. He had reviewed reports, spoken only when necessary, and yet his attention drifted in rare, unplanned intervals back to a single moving figure from the previous night. It was not emotional attachment, at least not in the way he understood such things, but it was persistence, something he did not ignore, because ignoring anything had never been part of how he survived. By midday, Emma's routine resumed its familiar pattern, serving customers, cleaning tables, and moving through conversations that blurred together, until a moment near the entrance shifted everything again. A black vehicle that did not match the usual traffic outside the diner paused briefly across the street, still long enough to feel intentional, then moved on without explanation. She noticed it only as a passing detail, but for reasons she could not name, her focus sharpened, her instincts reacting before her thoughts could catch up. At the same time, Ethan received confirmation from one of his silent observers that the subject of last night's surveillance had been approached indirectly by unknown variables, a detail that changed nothing outwardly, but altered everything internally within his assessment. He did not act immediately. He did not reveal himself. Yet his decision-making began to shift around a new fixed point that had not existed before her. That evening, as Emma finished her shift and stepped outside into fading daylight, the world felt unchanged to anyone watching from a distance. But for Ethan, observing again from somewhere unseen within the city structure, something subtle had already formed, a boundary he had not drawn consciously, but now refused to let others cross. And without either of them acknowledging it, the invisible distance between control and vulnerability had begun to collapse into something neither fully understood. The third day began with a quieter kind of tension in Chicago, as if the city itself had adjusted to a pattern that no one could fully recognize, but everyone subconsciously followed. Emma Walker arrived at the diner earlier than usual, moving through her opening routine with careful efficiency. Yet her thoughts repeatedly drifted back to the strange consistency of the past 2 days, moments that felt ordinary on the surface but carried an unexplained weight beneath them. She tried to dismiss it as stress, but even simple sounds like passing engines outside or the brief hesitation of strangers entering the diner seemed slightly more noticeable than before. Across the city, Ethan Cole was already deep within his controlled environment, a space defined by silence, precision, and information that flowed toward him without interruption. He had not changed his schedule, yet something within his attention had subtly shifted, as though part of his focus had been anchored elsewhere without his explicit permission. Reports were delivered, decisions were made, but in the pauses between actions, his awareness returned to a single variable he had not formally classified. That variable was Emma Walker, though he did not name it as emotion or attachment, only as relevance that refused to diminish. By late morning, Emma experienced her first clear interruption of routine when a customer at the diner mentioned, almost casually, that someone had been asking general questions about staff schedules in nearby businesses. The comment was vague and unconfirmed, but it lodged itself in her thoughts longer than it should have, creating a subtle fracture in her sense of normalcy. Meanwhile, Ethan received a brief update from one of his indirect observation channels, indicating that attention around the diner's vicinity had increased in small, irregular patterns that did not align with typical activity. He did not respond immediately, but the information was not dismissed either. Instead, it was integrated into a growing internal structure of awareness that now consistently included her location as a point of silent reference. That evening, as Emma stepped outside after her shift, she noticed for the first time that the street across from the diner seemed unusually still, not empty, but controlled in a way that did not match the natural flow of the city. She hesitated briefly, then continued walking, unaware that from a distant vantage point, Ethan Cole had already begun adjusting unseen parameters around her daily path, not with direct contact, but with quiet influence that reshaped proximity itself. And in that unspoken overlap between her ordinary life and his controlled world, the boundary between coincidence and intention continued to thin, though neither of them yet understood who had stepped closer first. The moment he stepped between her and the world, everything around them felt like it stopped breathing. The city lights outside the glass windows of the penthouse flickered in silence, as if even they understood the weight of what had just changed. The woman stood still, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear alone, but from the shock of realizing that the man she barely understood had just made a decision that would alter both of their lives. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere, turning the room into something heavier, something charged with unspoken meaning. People around them lowered their gaze, sensing that any wrong movement could break a fragile balance they could not see but instinctively respected. He turned his head slightly toward her, his expression controlled but unreadable, as if he was carefully measuring the consequences of being here in this exact moment. She wanted to speak, but the words stayed trapped in her throat, tangled between confusion and a strange sense of safety she did not want to admit. For a long moment, nothing happened except the sound of distant city traffic below, muted by thick glass and thicker tension. Then he finally spoke, his tone calm but absolute, not as an order but as a statement of fact that no one in the room would challenge. It was not about control, not about dominance, but about decision. A line had been drawn without permission from anyone else. The people around them began to slowly retreat, not physically pushed, but emotionally understanding they were no longer part of what was unfolding. She noticed the subtle details then, the way his posture softened just slightly when he looked at her again, as if she was the only part of the room that required careful attention. That realization unsettled her more than anything else. She had expected cold distance, yet what she saw was precision wrapped around something almost protective, something she could not easily categorize. Outside, the city continued as if nothing had changed, cars moving through streets, lights blinking across buildings, life continuing in ignorance of the shift that had just occurred behind reinforced glass. Inside, however, the world had narrowed down to two people standing in a silence that felt heavier than any argument. She finally managed to take a small step back, trying to regain a sense of normalcy, But even that movement felt different, as if the air itself adjusted around her. He did not stop her. Instead, he watched, as though understanding that trust could not be forced, only allowed to grow or fade on its own. And in that quiet restraint, something unfamiliar began to form between them, not spoken, not defined, but undeniably present. It was not safety as she had known it before, nor was it danger in the way she once imagined. It was something in between, unstable and yet strangely steady when he was near. The moment lingered, stretching time into something soft and uncertain, as if the story they were both part of had quietly changed direction without asking either of them for permission. The silence after his words did not end when the room emptied. It only changed shape. Now it belonged entirely to them, stretching across the wide penthouse like something alive but unseen. She stood near the edge of the living space, close enough to the glass wall that reflected the city lights, yet far enough to feel like she was on the boundary of another world. He remained where he was, not moving. Closer, not retreating, simply existing in a way that made distance feel intentional rather than accidental. She tried to steady her breathing, telling herself that nothing had truly changed, yet her instincts refused to agree. There was something about the way he watched her that made her feel acknowledged in a way she was not used to, as if she was not an inconvenience or a background presence, but something that required attention and restraint. She finally spoke, her voice quieter than she intended, asking the question she had been holding back since the moment everything shifted. His answer came after a pause, not because he was uncertain, but because he seemed to choose each word with care, as if careless speech could break something fragile between them. He explained nothing in dramatic terms, nothing exaggerated or theatrical, only simple truths about choice and consequence, about how certain moments cannot be reversed once they are made. As he spoke, she realized he was not trying to convince her of anything, only to make sure she understood the reality she was now standing inside. Outside, the city continued its normal rhythm, unaware that inside this high place above it, something quietly irreversible had taken shape. She looked away for a moment, toward the distant lights of traffic moving along streets that felt impossibly far from her current thoughts. For the first time, she noticed the weight of her own presence in this place, not as someone passing through, but as someone being observed and accounted for. When she looked back at him, there was no change in his expression, but something in his stillness felt different, less like control and more like a tension that refused to leave. She did not know when it happened, but the fear she had expected to feel never fully arrived. Instead, it was replaced by a complicated awareness that made her question her own assumptions about what danger and safety were supposed to feel like. He finally moved, only a small adjustment in position, closing a fraction of the distance without invading it, and that small change altered the entire atmosphere again. It was not comfort, not familiarity, but something quieter and more difficult to name, a presence that made silence feel less empty and more intentional. She realized then that nothing about this situation would return to what it had been before, not because of force, but because of the strange gravity that now existed between two people who had not chosen each other in any simple way, yet could no longer ignore the fact that their lives had already begun to shift around the space they shared. The night settled deeper over the city, but inside the penthouse, time no longer felt connected to anything outside its walls. She had stopped trying to understand the situation in simple terms, because nothing about it behaved in a simple way anymore. Instead, she focused on small details, the quiet rhythm of her own breathing, the faint reflection of city lights on polished surfaces, the way distance between them seemed to shift even when neither of them moved. He remained in the same general place, but his presence no longer felt distant or separate from her space. It felt integrated into it, as if the room had quietly adjusted its boundaries without announcing it. She noticed how her thoughts kept returning to his earlier words, not because they were dramatic, but because they were precise, stripped of exaggeration, leaving no room for easy dismissal. That clarity made them harder to ignore. She finally sat down, not out of surrender, but out of the realization that standing only made her feel more exposed to her own uncertainty. The chair beneath her felt real, grounding her in a way the rest of the room did not. He observed her shift without comment, his attention steady but not invasive, like someone allowing space to exist while still remaining fully aware of it. After a long silence, she asked a question she did not fully expect him to answer in any comforting way, but she needed to hear it spoken aloud anyway. His response came in the same controlled tone as before, neither soft nor harsh, simply honest in a way that avoided illusion. He did not offer promises, only perspective, describing what could not be undone and what would naturally follow from the choices already made. As he spoke, she realized that what unsettled her most was not his authority or presence, but the consistency of it. There were no sudden shifts, no emotional extremes, only a steady line of intention that refused to break or scatter under pressure. Outside, the city lights continued their constant movement, indifferent and unaware, while inside, something quieter and more permanent was forming between two people who were still learning how to exist in the same emotional space. She looked at him again, this time with less resistance and more curiosity, as if trying to understand not just what he was doing, but why her instincts had begun to respond differently in his presence. He did not move closer, yet the distance between them no longer felt like separation. It felt like choice. And in that realization, she understood that whatever this was becoming, it was no longer defined by the moment that started it, but by everything that would continue to unfold from it, whether she was ready for it or not. The morning came without any real transition, as if the night had simply dissolved rather than ended. Light filtered through the tall windows of the penthouse, soft and gray, touching surfaces that still held the memory of the previous evening. She had not slept properly. Her thoughts had remained active long after silence settled, replaying fragments of conversation, pauses, and the steady way he had spoken, as if every word had already been weighed long before being said. When she finally stood, she moved slowly, not because she was tired in a physical sense alone, but because her awareness of everything around her felt sharper than usual. The space she was in no longer felt unfamiliar, yet it did not feel fully hers either. It felt shared in a way that was difficult to define. He was already awake when she noticed him, positioned near the far side of the room where morning light did not fully reach. He was not doing anything that demanded attention, simply existing in a calm stillness that contrasted with her internal uncertainty. There was no urgency in his posture, no visible change from the night before, yet something about the continuity of his presence made her more aware of her own instability. She hesitated before speaking, choosing her words carefully, as if testing whether ordinary language still functioned normally between them. He responded in the same measured way as before, not interrupting, not correcting, only acknowledging. What unsettled her was not what he said, but the absence of contradiction in it. Everything he expressed remained aligned with itself, as if inconsistency had no place in his way of thinking. She walked closer to the window, needing space to process the unfamiliar calm that had begun to form in the environment around her. From there, the city looked unchanged, people moving through streets, vehicles continuing their patterns, life proceeding without awareness of anything significant shifting above it. Yet she felt as if her own internal perspective had moved slightly out of alignment with that normal world. When she turned back toward him, she noticed he was watching not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that registered it. That distinction mattered more than she expected. It suggested recognition without intrusion, awareness without pressure. She asked another question, not because she expected clarity, but because silence had begun to feel too full. His answer did not simplify anything. Instead, it expanded the space between certainty and uncertainty, leaving her with more awareness rather than less confusion. He did not offer resolution. He offered structure. And within that structure, she began to realize that nothing about her situation was accidental in the way she had first assumed. Every moment leading to this point had already created consequences that now existed independently of her initial reaction to them. As the morning light grew slightly brighter, she understood that what was forming between them was not a sudden event, but a continuing state, something that would persist regardless of whether she fully understood it yet. And in that realization, she felt the quiet weight of a truth she was only beginning to accept, that certain connections do not announce themselves as decisions. They reveal themselves slowly as something already in motion. The day unfolded slowly, without any dramatic shift, yet everything felt subtly different to her now. The penthouse no longer seemed like an unfamiliar space she had been pulled into by circumstance, but rather a place that was gradually becoming part of a larger pattern she could not yet fully understand. She moved through it carefully, noticing how her awareness had changed. Every sound felt slightly more defined, every pause between movements more meaningful. He remained present in the background of that awareness, not intruding, not demanding attention, but never truly outside of it either. His presence had become a kind of constant reference point, something her mind measured without conscious effort. When she entered the main living space, she found him near the same position as before, not because he had not moved, but because his stillness made any position feel like continuity rather than change. There was a document on the table, but he was not focused on it in a way that suggested urgency. Instead, he seemed to be waiting, not impatiently, but deliberately, as if timing itself was something he understood differently than she did. She hesitated again before speaking, noticing that hesitation had become a pattern she could not easily break. When she finally asked what would happen next, the question carried more weight than she intended, because it was not only about logistics or immediate decisions, but about direction, about what kind of reality she was now expected to inhabit. He answered in the same steady tone as before, explaining that nothing would return to what it had been, not because of force, but because certain alignments, once formed, naturally continue. His words were not dramatic, yet they created a sense of structure around uncertainty, as if the unknown had boundaries she could begin to recognize even if she could not yet define them. She walked closer to the table, not to the documents, but to the space between them, as if proximity might help her understand what language could not fully express. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence felt less like absence and more like an ongoing exchange that did not require sound. She realized then that her perception of control had already shifted. What she once believed was a series of isolated choices now felt like part of a continuous flow, where each moment influenced the next without obvious breaks. He finally looked up at her directly, not in a way that pressured or instructed, but in a way that acknowledged her presence as something that mattered within this unfolding structure. That recognition did something unexpected. It did not resolve her confusion, but it changed the way she experienced it. It made her realize that uncertainty itself was not being imposed on her, but shared in a strange and balanced way that neither of them could fully define yet. Outside, the city remained unchanged, moving forward in its ordinary rhythm, unaware of the subtle shift taking place in a high space above it. Inside, however, something had stabilized into a quiet continuity, not certainty, but direction, and she understood without being told that whatever came next would not be a departure from what had already begun, but its natural continuation. The final stretch of the day felt quieter, but not lighter. It was the kind of quiet that carries meaning rather than emptiness, as if everything had already been decided and was now simply unfolding without resistance. She remained in the penthouse, no longer treating it as a temporary place she might leave soon, but also not yet accepting it as something permanent. That in-between state reflected how she felt internally, suspended between familiarity and uncertainty, unable to fully commit to either interpretation of what was happening. He was present as he had been throughout the previous hours, not shifting his behavior in any noticeable way, yet his consistency itself had become the most noticeable aspect of the room. There was no urgency in him, no visible tension, only a controlled steadiness that made everything else feel slightly less stable by comparison. She found herself watching him more than she intended, not out of suspicion, but out of a growing need to understand how someone could remain so unchanged while everything around them subtly adjusted. When she finally spoke, her question was simpler than before, but the weight behind it was heavier. She asked what this meant for her future, not in abstract terms, but in the practical sense of what life would look like from this point forward. He did not answer immediately, not because he was avoiding the question, but because he seemed to treat it as something that required precision rather than reaction. When he did speak, his explanation was not a promise or a reassurance, but a clarification of direction. He described continuity rather than transformation, suggesting that what had already begun would not reset or reverse, only expand into its next form. There was no dramatic language in his response, yet it carried a finality that felt more permanent than any forceful declaration could have been. She listened carefully, noticing that her reaction was no longer purely fear or confusion, but something more complicated that included recognition and reluctant understanding. The idea that her life had already begun to follow a path she did not consciously design unsettled her, but it also explained more than she was willing to admit. Outside the windows, the city continued its constant movement, indifferent to the quiet shift that had taken place above it, where two people were negotiating a reality that existed outside ordinary expectation. She turned away for a moment, not to escape the conversation, but to process the fact that her resistance no longer felt absolute. It had softened without her permission, replaced by a cautious awareness that she could not ignore. When she looked back at him, she noticed something different in the way he observed her. It was not evaluation or control, but recognition of change, as if he could see the exact point where certainty in her had begun to loosen. That realization did not resolve anything, but it clarified something important. Whatever this connection was becoming, it was not built on sudden decisions, but on continuous adjustment, where every moment added another layer without erasing what came before. And in that understanding, she realized that the story she thought she was resisting had already become the environment she was learning to live inside.